Okay, so what do I think is the solution to all of these issues and problems? Modern society is desperately running around trying to find out what the solution is to all these problems. While some of these mechanisms are completely natural and something that happens to all of us human beings, um, all of us would really, really like to see that day come where there's not such a gap between the rich and the poor, and that women are treated well and respectfully, and that there isn't racism, that the minorities and strangers in any group would feel comfortable and welcome. I really believe that this vision is nothing short of the kingdom of God. It's described in the Bible as being the holy mountain of Zion, or uh, yeah, where the lion and the lamb can take a nap together, and the child and the snake can play together, and there'd be no problem or issue. We have this dream. And actually, if you looked back at the speeches and some of the visions that Martin Luther King Jr. had, his vision really was the kingdom of God coming down to earth. And unfortunately, the powers that really were in place at the time were incredibly threatened of him, and they also tried to use the law in order to watch him and take him out. They really looked for any kind of thing that they could accuse him for. The government was monitoring him very, very carefully. Some of his indiscretions as a pastor, having affairs with multiple women, were really captured on tape. And, we hear stories about even President Kennedy listening in on the surveillance tapes of Martin Luther King Jr. So we definitely see all these power clashes, and unfortunately, we saw Martin Luther King Jr. die a martyr's death. But it wasn't just Martin Luther King Jr. who died in a clash of power. Even at the same time, we saw Malcolm X, who didn't represent the Christian worldview. He was Muslim, and he definitely had a less forgiving stance on the situation, and he was also martyred. And so, anytime there's a crash of power, you're going to see a lot of tremendous problems. And there's been martyrs throughout time trying to basically bring about change for everybody. And so far, no one has been able to do it yet. So I'm going to talk about my particular vision of the kingdom of heaven, so to speak, and what it would really take to see a prosperous land of happy people, where there's not this tremendous these problems between rich and poor, and oppression and violence and so on. I think it would really take having a king who was so secure in the fact that he had power, or so secure in the fact that God was sovereign, that if the sovereign God chose a new king to take his place, that he could truly surrender to God, knowing that he was held accountable to God, that God was watching, and he was completely surrendered to God's plan. So that if somebody challenged his authority or his power, you know, we see this in the book of Kings in the Bible with King Solomon, where we saw tremendous judgments coming from Solomon. Solomon dealt with his enemies with precision, wisdom, fairness. It wasn't that he was a wimp. It wasn't that he was just nice and he just forgave everybody, because there were a few judgments that Solomon had to make that was incredibly difficult and very hard, but he was able to do it. But at the same time, you would have to be very, very secure and not feeling threatened or challenged. And we even see that later on in Solomon's life, where as he got older, he started to offend God. And so God chose to split his kingdom in half and give it to another guy. And King Solomon couldn't just say, "Okay, God, you're in charge. You're the boss." The thing that Solomon did was go after the new guy and basically try to kill him, which doesn't ever work, because if God decides to give somebody something, you can't do anything about it. It's just a matter of time. You only rack up your own bad guilt by oppressing people if you choose to go that route. So we would have to see that. We would have to see a king who's completely comfortable in being king and not threatened to make hasty or unfair, unwise decisions. And he would also have to truly be able to surrender power if it was actually taken from him in a graceful and good way. And this is one of the reasons why the Capitol riots were as concerning as it was, and some people were threatened by Donald Trump as they were for not accepting the vote, because that really fringes on somebody who refuses to relinquish power when it's been decided that it's no longer theirs to have. So we definitely see that. The other thing, a country would have to have very, very few laws. You can't have a billion gazillion laws and have a free, happy, prosperous, progressive group of people. You can't do it. We see even in the Bible, if we want to use that as another example, the Torah, we had so many different laws, and that changed when Jesus Christ came as king, as Messiah. He boiled it down to 3: love God, love your neighbor as yourself, and that was basically it. And of course, if you're doing those things, if you're loving your neighbor, you're not stealing from them, you're not killing them, you're not stealing their rights, or you're not doing anything to hurt your neighbor. So that really does cover everything. So long as and then sometimes it can even open the door up to the possibility that there are times when you need to break the law for love. So that higher law of love is really all encompassing and all perfect and all wonderful. So that would have to take place. There would have to be very, very simple few laws, and those laws would have to be designed for the protection and the rights of all the citizens without getting too complicated or too many. The other thing that would have to happen is that those laws would have to be set in stone. Anytime you have somebody who's trying to take advantage of another person, minority or woman, or one power group to the next, they're always changing the laws depending on how to make that one person they're challenged by a criminal. So let's say one day it's completely okay to steal a cookie from the kitchen. It's even encouraged, but then when that one person steals a cookie, then that's stealing and that's wrong. When the law becomes fluid, injustice and oppression happens. The other thing that would have to happen is everybody would have to be punished exactly in the same way for the same kinds of transgressions. You couldn't have, well, it's okay if white men steal the cookie, maybe they'll get a week in prison. But then if I do it as a woman, or if somebody else does it as a black person or a person of color, if they steal that cookie, oh my goodness, they're going to be sentenced to a year to life. That's where the law changes depending on which group. So authority being the top people in authority, making sure that the law is upheld, that the rights of citizens are definitely respected, but it's not overly oppressive, it's not fluid, and the law is good for everybody. And you have that one person in authority, or that many people in authority, who aren't threatened and challenged enough to oppress in order to keep power for themselves. Whoever it is that's in charge and in power has to be able to surrender that power. If we really had those particular things in play, we absolutely wouldn't have oppression. We wouldn't have problems. We wouldn't have these tremendous gaps in poverty versus wealth, unless it had to do with personal responsibility and personal initiative. If you're a person, if you're a woman, or if you're a person of color, and you're working very, 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 very hard, and no matter what you do, the person in authority of that company or whatever else just doesn't want you to climb up higher because they don't like the fact that you're a woman, or they don't like the idea of seeing a person of color in charge, then they're going to do what they can do to knock you down. And in that particular environment, it doesn't matter how hard a person works, they're never going to progress, they're never going to do well. So, but if you had a completely fair company and you had some people who wanted to work and some people who didn't want to work, there would be a natural difference between pay and all those other things. But that would be completely natural, and there wouldn't really be anything that you could do besides motivate somebody to work harder, or in whichever way. So, in my personal opinion, this is the only solution. The solution is not digging up all the sins of the past. It's not critical race theory. It is not hating on white men, even if they've been oppressive, horrible people. It's not to, it's not to over criticize the black population. It's not to over criticize the police. It's not to over criticize those who hold authority. And it's also not to even over criticize a population. Although a population also has responsibility. If you have a very, very rebellious group of people who keep on breaking the laws and the rights of other people, you're going to have problems. It's very difficult for a righteous ruler to continue on being righteous when they're constantly provoked by the rebellion of the people. So, one of the reasons why this mythical kingdom of heaven is so mythical is because the idea that a king would be this surrendered to God, that comfortable with his own authority, and that the people would also surrender to his authority and not rebel, is incredibly unlikely, and it's a very, very difficult scenario. But nevertheless, if people are really, 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 really gung-ho, they really want to see this change take place, that's the only way that I can possibly perceive it happening. Rioting is not going to help. It's only going to make things worse, and it's only going to burn stuff up that was completely valuable and could have been used for something. So it's wasteful. So that's my personal opinion on that.